Have you ever felt like your presence in the home you helped support suddenly became a nuisance? As if even your hunger was an exaggeration? I did. For 2 whole years, I was the one paying for all the groceries. Every month, their retirement payments went straight to their card. I did it wholeheartedly, because I thought it was the right thing to do. Family is meant to be cared for, supported. And I thought I was being cared for, too. But I wasn't. They said it was easier this way. That I didn't need to worry about anything, that they were taking care of me. But little by little, the care turned into control. And the control turned into humiliation. It started with small things. A change in the grocery list, a comment about my taste being old-fashioned. I ignored it. I thought it was just a nagging issue. But then they started choosing everything for me. Everything. Even my mealtimes. "You've eaten today, right?" This phrase became a routine. It was said with that sweet tone on the outside, but loaded with judgment on the inside. Sound familiar? That way of saying something that sounds like concern, but is actually a reminder that you're being monitored. That you're a burden. One day I grabbed a yogurt at the grocery store. Just a simple yogurt. It had been my favorite since I was young. That strawberry flavor with little bits, you know? I discreetly put it in my cart, thinking no one would notice. But in the line, my daughter-in-law snatched the little container from my hand and said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, "This isn't good for you. Let's not waste it on old people's nonsense." I swallowed hard. I felt my face heat up. I glanced at my grandson, who was standing there, and he simply looked away. That day I cried. But it wasn't the loud, soothing kind. It was a pent-up, silent cry, the kind that hurts inside. I cried in my room, with the door closed, because even crying became something I couldn't do around them. And all of this, in my own home. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt like you've lost even the right to choose what you eat? To be treated as someone who still thinks, who feels, who deserves respect? It's hard to explain how much this hurts. It's not just about food. It's about what it represents. Choice, autonomy, dignity. And when you realize you can't even take a cookie without being watched, something inside you starts to die. Or, it starts to wake up. But in that silence, something also began to transform within me. An idea. A feeling. A decision. They thought they were dealing with a frail old woman. But they forgot who I was. Everything I'd lived through. And most of all, they forgot that even a woman in silence has a limit. And that's when everything started to change. My name is Dorothy. I'm 74 years old. And until recently, I believed that love and loyalty were enough to guarantee respect. I spent 42 years of my life as a seamstress. I folded fabric, cut thread, and embroidered dreams. I raised my children among hems and buttons. I've always been simple, but never weak. I've always been discreet, but never invisible. But over time, I've realized there's a hidden truth about aging in families. A truth no one likes to tell. When Brian, my youngest son, lost his job, I didn't think twice. I opened the doors of my home, just as I'd given up so many other things for them throughout my life. It wasn't charity, it was love. He was with Melissa, and they both seemed grateful at first. They told me it was just for a while, until they got back on their feet. I kept telling myself, it'll pass. Every family goes through difficult times. But this one dragged on longer than I could have imagined. Over time, the house that was mine began to have rules that weren't mine. The food changed, the schedules changed, the decisions. They no longer included me. Even so, when Brian got a new job and they decided to move, I went with him. It was logical, they said. More space, a better location, more security for me. They made it seem like a good idea. And deep down, I wanted to believe that gesture was more a sign of care than convenience. But it's curious how, sometimes, what seems like protection hides control. In the new house, the details became too small to ignore. They offered me a room, a corner. And with it, a rigid routine that made me feel like I was living a script I didn't write. Food was purchased without my input. Meals were planned, counted. I felt part of a plan that didn't consult me. I was still the one helping financially, but it seemed like that no longer mattered. They told me I should rest, that I'd already done too much, that now it was time to be taken care of. But there was something in that sentence that bothered me. Because care that doesn't respect individuality becomes a prison in disguise. And that's when I began to notice a subtle shift within me. Something quiet, but intense. It wasn't anger yet. It was more like a warning. As if my own body was saying, "Dorothy, wake up. This isn't care. This is control." I heard footsteps throughout the house, whispers that stopped when I entered the room. Small decisions were being made for me, as if I no longer had the ability to choose. My favorite dishes disappeared from the pantry. I was told it wasn't healthy, that it was expensive, that it wasn't worth it. And yet, I remained there, washing my cup, waiting for the scent of coffee that never came, setting the table and sitting down as if I were just passing through, in someone's house. When, in truth, I was the root of it all, of that entire structure. But roots, when they're too old, are sometimes ripped out unceremoniously. It's strange how we accept emotional crumbs, thinking they're gratitude. But they're not. We keep quiet because we've learned that complaining is ugly, that causing discomfort is rude. But what no one tells you is the impact of this silent self-denial. How much it corrodes. How slowly it erases you. I could see the way Melissa spoke to me, always with that passive-aggressive tone, as if she were doing me a favor by leaving me there. Brian. He seemed increasingly distant. He laughed at her jokes, looked away when I tried to say something. It was as if, little by little, my presence was becoming just a habit, a piece of furniture in the corner of the house. And it was precisely in this hushed silence, in this feeling of being trapped in a scenario that was once mine, that my mindset began to shift. I began to remember the woman I once was, the choices I made, how hard I fought to raise my children with dignity. And most of all, I realized that being old isn't the same as being fragile. It's having too much history to accept being erased. Because it wasn't just about food. It was about being diminished. About being ignored. About losing the right to exist autonomously. And when we see the truth behind what they call care, it becomes impossible to keep pretending. That's when an idea began to emerge. Subtle, but firm. A decision that would change everything. At first, it seemed harmless. Those loose comments at breakfast, said with muffled chuckles, as if they were just family jokes. Grandma only eats old people's food. I listened, pretended it wasn't about me, gave that polite smile, because I'd learned that silence avoids arguments. But inside, I was already starting to feel a pang. A pang that wasn't exactly pain. It was something quieter, almost imperceptible, but slowly spreading. A kind of emotional erosion, you know? As if my presence were tolerated, but not wanted. As if I were always one step out of place. Things started to change behind the scenes of my routine. Small decisions that no longer involved me. The grocery list was one of them. Before, I'd carefully write down what was missing. My favorite tea, the bread with the crispiest crust, the right kind of cheese. Silly details to outsiders, but to me they were rituals of dignity. Suddenly, I started looking at ready-made lists on the fridge. Written by her. "Don't worry, Dorothy. I've already organized everything." And I thought, but I've always been the one who took care of the house, the food, the bills. Now, I can't even suggest what we'll eat. I tried to put a small jar of gelatin in the basket once. It was something simple, inexpensive, but it brought back memories. She took it away and said it was full of sugar, that it was bad for me. Another time, I picked up a package of my favorite cookies and heard, "You don't have the budget for that." Budget. I was paying for the entire grocery store with my retirement. But no one asked me about it. And the strangest thing is, I started to doubt myself. to wonder if I was overreacting. This is the cruelest part of emotional manipulation. It makes you question what was once a certainty. The impact of this isn't immediate. It's sneaky. It invades your decisions, your self-confidence, your identity. You start to hesitate before speaking, to think twice before suggesting something. You start to watch their faces, trying to predict their reactions, as if you're walking on eggshells in a house where there should be a welcome. And before you know it, you're already adapting to silence to avoid another embarrassing scene. There were days when I pretended not to be hungry just to avoid having to order anything. I'd sit by the window with a warm tea, clutching the cup tightly, as if that moment were all I had left. I watched the movement outside, but it was inside me that the biggest changes were happening. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It happened in the details, in the gaze that didn't come, in the hastily served dish, in the lack of invitation to leave the kitchen and sit at the table with them. These micro-humiliations hurt more than direct insults, because they're too subtle to point out, but violent enough to leave a scar. And, worst of all, no one sees. No one hears. No one validates. After all, it's just food, right? Just a joke. Just a suggestion. Just a new dinner time. Just a no need for that. Just, until the accumulation of alon'ts becomes a wall. And I was already on the other side of it, alone. I began to realize that this wasn't carelessness. It was a decision. It was a conscious choice to exclude myself. The hidden truth behind those actions was harsher than I wanted to admit. There was a silent effort to silence me, to diminish me, to corner me, as if my phase of having opinions had passed. And this affected my mindset in a way I didn't even expect. Because when you start to see what's really behind the words, everything changes. Clarity arrives. And with it, a question. How long will I allow them to decide for me? The funny thing is that the biggest changes don't come with shouting or fighting. They begin with a thought. With a memory. With the memory of who you were before you gave up everything for those who now can't even hear you. And so it was that, one random day, while she was organizing the groceries without calling me, and I was pretending to read a magazine that wasn't even open, a thought crossed my mind forcefully. Maybe I should disappear for a while. Not to cause pain, but to remind them of the impact of my absence. This idea had been floating around in my head for days. At first, it seemed absurd. Then it started to make sense. Because sometimes, it's only by leaving the stage that you show the value you had on stage. And there, between the sound of the refrigerator opening and the sound of the list being taped to the wall, my decision began to dawn. The first time I thought things were changing was on my birthday. I woke up that day feeling a bit empty, I confess. My age weighed more heavily on the way I was treated than on the years themselves. I wasn't expecting anything anymore. No celebration, no gesture. I was preparing to spend the day sitting in the corner of the living room, watching whatever TV I'd been doing in silence for so many other moments. But to my surprise, the house was bustling. I saw bags, smells coming from the kitchen, and Melissa, a little more polite than usual. "Today's your day, Dorothy," she said with an almost convincing smile. For a moment, my chest warmed. I remained quiet, observing. I didn't want to create expectations, but I also didn't want to sabotage what could have been an attempt at a fresh start. I clung to that possibility like someone holding onto a thin rope in the dark. Fragile, but still a chance. That night, they called me into the living room. There was cake, candles, and even that somewhat timid happy birthday sung, but it brought a genuine smile to my face. They hugged me. Even Brian looked me in the eye and said, "Happy birthday, Mom." I took a deep breath, trying to balance relief with doubt. The emotion came from a place I hadn't visited in a long time. It felt real. It felt sincere. Until I took the first spoonful of cake. With the first bite, my throat started to itch. My stomach tightened. My body responded before I even realized. That cake had nuts. I've been allergic since I was young. Melissa knew. She'd seen my medical records, had taken me to the hospital once for a similar situation. When I questioned her, trying to remain calm, she laughed. She said she'd forgotten. That she'd rushed. That she'd gotten the cake ready. And Brian. He laughed along. "At least it's tasty, right?" he blurted, amused. I thought I was going to break down right there, but I held it in. I held on out of pride. Out of shame. Because I didn't want to ruin what seemed like a moment of peace. Even if that peace tasted like oblivion and neglect. I swallowed the pain, drank a glass of water, and went to my room. Alone. In silence. But not to cry, this time to think. And there, in the darkness of my room, as the muffled sound of the TV drifted in from the living room and they likely went on with their evening as if nothing had happened, I realized something important. That truce, that apparent attempt at connection, was nothing more than a facade. A show put on for show. A poorly rehearsed performance to maintain control disguised as affection. The revelation hit me hard, but it also brought clarity. It wasn't just about the cake. It was about what it represented: emotional neglect, contempt disguised as forgetfulness, control disguised as care. The hidden truth is that there are forms of abandonment that happen within one's own home, with smiles on the face and sweet words that ring hollow. That night was a turning point. An invisible rupture between what I still wanted to believe and what I finally saw. And it was in this space between illusion and lucidity that my mindset began to truly transform. For the first time in a long time, I stopped justifying their actions. I stopped sugarcoating. I began to see things through different eyes. The eyes of someone who no longer expected anything, but who still had much to offer, and deserved so much more than that. The next morning, Melissa offered me coffee as if nothing had happened. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, in that same sweet voice of someone practicing kindness. I smiled back, without showing my teeth. Something inside me had changed. And she didn't know it. Neither did Brian. They thought the previous night's gesture had touched me, that they had managed to silence me once again with cake, congratulations, and a warm hug. Little did they know the impact of that moment on my transformation process. That was the final spark. Not the one that explodes everything all at once, but the one that slowly ignites a flame of resolve. And there, between a sip of coffee and a random phrase about the weather forecast, I knew with absolute certainty. This story wouldn't end as they imagined. Because even when everything seems calm on the outside, it's behind the scenes of the soul that the greatest twists and turns begin to be written. After that cake, the fake smile, and the forgetfulness that almost landed me in the hospital, everything changed inside me. On the outside, I continued to act the same way. I woke up early, put the kettle on, drank my tea from the same cup as always. But on the inside, every gesture was now charged with awareness. With a gaze that scrutinized everything more carefully. I began to notice things I'd previously ignored. The tone of voice that changed when I entered the room. The decisions made as if I weren't there. The way they gave me small tasks, just so I wouldn't feel useless, but without ever giving me back the right to choose. And then came the new rule. No more cooking. "Dorothy, we worry. What if you get distracted and leave the gas on?" Melissa said it with that air of superiority disguised as kindness. She spoke as if I were a bratty child. As if 42 years of cooking meant nothing. As if the dinners I'd made, the Sunday lunches, the lovingly made birthday cakes, they'd all simply evaporated. They didn't say it directly, but what was clear was, they no longer trusted me. One day, I went looking for my recipe book. That old one, with its yellowed pages, covered in notes, smelling of time and affection. And it was gone. I rummaged through the kitchen drawers, looked in the cabinets, and asked discreetly. The answer? Maybe it was thrown out during a cleanup. It was all worn out, right? I don't remember feeling such silent anger. It wasn't just a book. It was the story of my life told through flavors. And they threw it away like trash. With each gesture, I felt more erased. More forgotten. But what really hurt wasn't the control. It was the contempt. The erasure. The way every little piece of my history was being unceremoniously ripped away. They tried to convince me it was for my own good. More security, more practicality, less mess. But in practice, it was as if they were removing me from the game of life, little by little. I tried to talk to Brian. It was one night when the silence in the house seemed even heavier. He was sitting on the couch, cell phone in hand. I approached slowly. I sat down next to him and said, as calmly as possible, "Son, I'm sad." He didn't even look at me. He sighed, as if he already knew what he was going to hear, and replied, "Mom, you're getting paranoid. Melissa just wants to help you." Those words hit me in the chest like a punch. Paranoid. As if my pain were made up. As if the emptiness I carried was exaggerated. There, I realized that my journey of sacrifice, surrender, and unconditional love had been translated as neediness. As if I were asking for too much attention, when all I wanted was to be treated with the dignity any human being deserves, especially after having dedicated my entire life to those who now pretended I was just a detail. The hidden truth behind that help speech was control. It was an attempt to push me into a comfortable corner, where I wouldn't be a nuisance, where I would be merely a passive presence. A figure who moves but doesn't express opinions, who breathes but doesn't decide. And the more they thought they were protecting me, the more I felt they were silencing me. I observed everything calmly, every word, every gesture, and I began to remember who I was before the pain, before the invalidation. I remembered the clothes I sewed, the problems I solved alone, the decisions I made when no one was there for me. This memory didn't come with resentment. It came with strength, with clarity, with the kind of courage that comes when you realize you can no longer wait for someone to give you back what was taken. You'll have to go get it yourself. And it was amidst this hushed silence, this carefully constructed isolation, that a decision began to form. At first, it was just a thought. What if I left? But as the days passed, it grew. It became a plan. It became a real desire. I still didn't know exactly how, or when. But something inside me told me that, this time, it wasn't just a passing thought. It was the beginning of a new version of myself. One that would no longer accept being pushed out of its own story. The idea of leaving began as a whisper, but after that night, it became almost a scream inside me. It was a trivial moment, one of those that seem small to the outsider but carry immense weight to the one who feels it inside. Melissa was organizing the pantry, and in an innocent attempt to be part of the household, I mentioned that it had been a while since I'd eaten those beans I'd always insisted on having. She didn't respond immediately. She just stopped, turned to me with that expression of someone who has no patience left, and blurted out, "You want old man's food? Buy your own house and do whatever you want." He didn't shout. He didn't curse. But the sentence came like a knife sheathed in contempt. And what hurt most was the tone. As if I were an inconvenient burden, someone who still insisted on existing outside the script they'd created for me. At the time, I couldn't react. I just took a deep breath and went back to my room. But that sentence, it didn't leave me. It kept echoing, running in my mind like a broken clock. And, unintentionally, it became a seed. You know when someone unknowingly plants in you the very thing that will set you free? That's exactly what happened. Because for the first time in a long time, I started to think about the possibility of having something of my own again. A place where I could choose what to eat, what to wear, what music to listen to. A space where I wouldn't be treated like an old painting hanging on the wall. That sentence, cruel as it was, had a greater impact than she could ever have imagined. She thought she was just silencing me, putting me in my place. But she was, without realizing it, pushing me toward a new kind of decision. In the days that followed, I began to notice details I'd previously ignored. The tone of my address, the way conversations shifted when I entered the room, the quick glances exchanged between Brian and Melissa, as if I were a matter to be managed, not a person to be respected. It was like watching backstage at a play I was no longer a part of. I was there, yes, but as an extra. And every time I tried to speak, I felt like I was screaming inside a locked room. Silence was my new language. Not because I wanted it to be, but because I learned that any attempt at expression was followed by irony, corrections disguised as care, or worse, that blank look of someone who simply isn't listening. With each gesture, I realized I was being pushed out of my role as matriarch. As if my journey were over and I should just wait, quietly, for the play to end. But I wasn't ready to leave the scene. I started thinking about everything I'd done in life. How I'd faced much greater difficulties, in times when everything was harder. I wasn't weak. I'd just forgotten that. And it was in that memory that I found the spark to take the first step. It wasn't a concrete decision yet, but it was a desire that was growing stronger. A desire to once again be the protagonist of my own life. Melissa's phrase, though said with contempt, became a mantra in my head. Buy your own house and do whatever you want. And I repeated it to myself, not with anger, but with determination. Because in that moment, I realized that was exactly what I wanted. A place where I could be free, without having to ask permission to be who I've always been. In the wee hours of the morning, I'd find myself awake, wondering how this could be possible. I began to remember a piece of land I'd inherited from my father years ago. A small, forgotten lot, but still in my name. I remembered an old savings account, unused for years. A life insurance policy I'd never touched. Little by little, that idea, which began as a provocation, began to take shape. I didn't tell anyone. Because I've learned that some plans need to be nurtured in silence. That certain decisions are best made away from the eyes of those who don't understand or respect you. And truly, I knew that if I said anything, they'd come up with the same old line. But where are you going alone? You don't need this right now. We're doing what's best for you. I already knew each argument. I'd heard them all, disguised as affection, hiding their fear of losing control. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to prove anything to anyone. I just wanted to breathe again, to choose my breakfast, to plant my herbs on the porch, to sit in my favorite chair without asking permission. I wasn't running away. I was coming home to myself. And every time I remembered that phrase, something inside me grew stronger. It wasn't just a wish anymore. It was a goal, an inner mission. And I knew that, at the right time, I would take the next step. It was strange to realize how the phrase that hurt me the most was also the one that gave me the most strength. Buy your own house and do whatever you want. It echoed in the simplest moments of the day, when I opened the fridge and saw that they'd swapped my yogurt for a tasteless diet one, when I sat on the couch and heard that that spot was reserved for Brian's dad, as if I were no longer part of the emotional furniture of that house. And yet, I kept my face serene. Not out of submission, but because there was something gestating inside me that needed silence to grow. I began to walk differently. My steps remained slow, yes, due to my age. But within me there was urgency. There was a rush. A kind of internal movement that cannot be seen, but transforms everything. I began to smile less to please and more to hide what was going on in my mind. And between these discreet smiles and silent dawns, the certainty was born. My journey was not over. It was beginning again. And this time, I wasn't going to ask permission. By the way, if any part of this story I've told you so far touched you, even just a little bit, if something inside you tightened, revolted, or reminded you of something you experienced or saw someone else experience, write it here in the comments. I read everything. And I can assure you that you're not alone. Because many people go through this in silence. By commenting, you not only vent, but give a voice to those who still don't have the courage to speak out. And when you like this video, when you subscribe to the channel, do you know what happens? This story reaches more people. More voices begin to connect. That's how we build this community. A community that listens, welcomes, and transforms. Because, yes, stories like this deserve to be told. And more than that, they need to be heard. I say this with an open heart. Because every comment I read reminds me that we are not alone on this journey. There is strength in sharing. There is healing. There is a new beginning. And while the house slept, and everything looked the same on the outside, I had already made my decision on the inside. I just needed the right moment to act. The right moment didn't arrive with clarion calls or grandiose signs. It arrived in the silence of routine, when everything seemed the same, but nothing was the same again. It came on an ordinary morning, when Melissa left for work and Brian stayed in his room, headphones on, oblivious to what was going on around him. I was in the kitchen, stirring the tea I don't even like that much, when I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was ready. It wasn't an idea anymore, it was a decision. And when the decision takes hold, we feel it in our bodies. Our chest breathes deeper, our gaze shifts. It was the moment. I picked up the phone and called Nancy. She was one of those friends life gave me after 60, when most people have already settled for the friendships they have. But not Nancy. She had that firm, direct manner, but with a heart that understood without needing to explain much. I simply said, "Remember that lot of Manuel's, the one that was forgotten years ago?" She responded with another question. "Do you want to sell?" And just hearing my own voice say yes, I knew the plan was already in motion. The next day, she took me to the bank. I was nervous, I won't lie, but I was also firm. Firm like someone who carries the weight of many poorly digested decisions and knows that this one, finally, is for her. I gathered my retirement savings, grabbed my forgotten savings, and searched for the lot documents stored in an old folder, wrapped in plastic. The manager looked at me with that, "Are you sure?" look, and I simply signed. When you've spent too much time being treated like a detail, signing something yourself feels almost sacred. The days that followed were the quietest of my life. But it was a good silence, full of movement within. While they thought I was just growing old in peace, I was reorganizing my existence. I researched places, called real estate agents, and made quick visits with Nancy's help. I saw many cold, cramped, soulless apartments, until I found this one. Simple, modest, but with a large window that let the sun in without asking permission. It was small, but it was mine. Enough for a life to begin again with dignity. The contract signing took place on a rainy afternoon, and I'll never forget the sound of pen hitting paper. It was as if each letter drew a new version of me. A more whole Dorothy. More real. More in control of her own story. On the way home, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. It didn't even feel like I'd just invested everything I had in an apartment. It felt like I'd just regained something they'd taken from me long ago without me realizing it. I prepared everything calmly. I stowed away some clothes, documents, books, photographs. Nothing that would draw attention. I made every move like someone dancing silently with their own freedom. Nancy took care of the practicalities. She scheduled the move and arranged the details with the movers. I just had to be ready. And I was. On the morning of the move, I left the coffee served as usual. I placed the note on the table, in my firm handwriting. Now I'm the one who chooses my food. I'm the one. I didn't write anything else. I didn't leave long explanations, because those who need them never really listen. I grabbed my bag, locked the door, and walked out onto the street as if stepping onto new ground, even if it was the same as always. I got into Nancy's truck and, for the first time in years, didn't look back. What I was leaving behind wasn't just a house. It was a story of silence, control, invisibility. What I carried with me was more than clothes or objects. I carried the courage to say enough without screaming. I carried the certainty that starting over at 74 isn't madness. It's an act of self-love. The move was quick. The guys came upstairs with the boxes, placing everything where I'd asked. And when the door closed, and the echo of my breathing filled the apartment, I understood what freedom was. It wasn't just being able to choose what to eat. It was being able to exist without fear, without censorship, without having to constantly justify yourself. I lit a small candle, put on an old record, and made, with my own hands, the first coffee in my new kitchen. I took a slice of bread and butter and ate slowly, as if savoring not only the food, but the right to make decisions for herself. It wasn't about food. It never was. It was about power, about respect, about redemption. And there, amidst the smell of coffee and the soft sound of music, something inside me aligned again, as if every broken piece began to fit together. I still didn't know what would happen from then on, but I knew in every way that my life was mine again. In my new home, there was no luxury. The walls were too white, the floor creaked a little when I walked, and the smell was still of fresh paint mixed with moving dust. But there, in that space that fit into fewer square feet than the old house where I'd been forgotten, there was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. A clean, almost weightless peace, as if I'd shed, along with the old furniture, the weight of the expectations others had placed upon me. For the first time in many years, I could hear my own thoughts without the noise of censorship. On the first day, I opened the large living room window, let the sun shine in, and felt the warmth of freedom on my face. Simple, I know. But when you spend so much time living under the gaze of those who measure you, even the simple becomes extraordinary. I went to the kitchen, calmly washed my hands, and for the first time in years, cooked chicken and rice, like I used to do on Sundays in my youth. That smell brought me back to the woman I was before being treated like a burden. I also made coffee with milk, strong, just the way I like it, without anyone telling me it was too late for coffee. I ate slowly, sitting at the table, elbows propped up, as if that moment were a sacred ritual. And it was. Because, there, it wasn't just about the food. It was about the right to decide, to serve yourself, to savor without guilt. Each bite tasted like victory. Not a blatant victory, laden with trophies, but a silent, mature victory, born of a shift in mindset. When you understand that you no longer need to beg for the basics, everything changes. And I knew that plate of chicken and rice was the first page of a new story. After eating, I walked around the house calmly. Every corner needed me, but I wasn't in a rush. I grabbed the small boxes I'd brought, carefully opened them, and began setting up my little corner. I placed my plants near the window, the same ones I'd hidden at Brian's because they took up space. Now they had a place of honor. I unrolled the quilt I'd sewn 20 years ago and covered the bed. I tacked old photos to the wall. My wedding, the little boys, me smiling with my parents on a random Sunday. That wall became my altar of memories. And even with my chest tight, I smiled. Because memory is also power. And no one was going to erase me from my own story anymore. It wasn't until nightfall, when everything was quiet and the apartment finally breathed with me, that I realized what had happened. The silence that had once crushed me was now my ally. It no longer came as contempt, but as a choice. The sound of the refrigerator running, the ticking of the clock, the wind rustling the fern leaves. Everything was mine. Every sound was a confirmation that I had begun anew. It wasn't easy. And I won't pretend loneliness didn't creep in. Of course it did. But there was a huge difference between being alone and being ignored. In my old home, I was an invisible presence. Here, I was a whole woman, master of my own destiny. And that was enough for me. I went to bed early that night. But before that, I sat on the edge of the bed and silently thanked them. Not to them, who left me with wounds, but to myself, who transformed those wounds into a road. Because the truth is this: no one gives back what they took. We have to get it back. And every small achievement that day, from the beans to the clean sheets, was an answer to all the times they said I couldn't do it anymore. Yes, I could. I could, and I did. There was still much to do. The cupboards were empty, the fridge needed groceries, and my wallet was already feeling the impact of each decision. But it was an impact I accepted with pride. Because there's no fairer price than the one paid for freedom. I knew I would face challenges, that I would have difficult days. But I also knew that each of those days would have a new meaning. And that, in itself, was reason enough to keep going. Months have passed since that first day in my new home. And I won't romanticize. There were difficult days. Days when the refrigerator was emptier than I'd like, when the street noise seemed too loud, and the absence of conversation weighed heavily on the late afternoon. But even on the silent days, there was something that hadn't existed before: lightness. Because now, what I lived was mine. The choices, the mistakes, the victories. Everything was mine. And that, for a woman who spent decades being interrupted, diminished and silenced, is worth more than any temporary comfort. It was one of those days when I was watering my plants, listening to an old record that kept me company on cloudy mornings, that the phone rang. A familiar number, but one that was no longer familiar. My heart didn't race. I didn't tremble. I felt neither fear nor anger. I simply answered, with the calm of someone who no longer owed anything to anyone. On the other end of the line, Brian's voice sounded weaker than I remembered. A mix of embarrassment and need. He began with a "Hi, Mom," followed by an uncomfortable silence, as if he didn't quite know what to say. And maybe you really didn't. Because those who get used to seeing others as weak lose it when they realize they stood up without asking for help. He said things were tough. That groceries were expensive, that bills were piling up, that Melissa was stressed, that they were both trying to get their lives back on track. And that month, they wouldn't be able to pay off their credit card, the very one they used for their monthly purchases. "Could you help, just a little?" he asked. And that question, said so naturally, brought back memories I'd rather not revisit. But I took a deep breath. Because now I had a different perspective. A different perspective. A different answer. I was silent for a few seconds, and perhaps he thought the line had dropped. But I was simply choosing my words with the care a wounded mother must exercise to maintain the balance between firmness and compassion. "Brian," I said, my voice calm, "today the one who takes care of my table is God. And he sees everything." On the other end, silence. And I continued, with the same calm tone I'd used so many times to teach him to walk, to eat, to talk. God never forgets those who respect or humiliate a mother. Never. I didn't need to say anything else. And neither did he. The call ended there, dry, cut short by a truth that can't be erased with justifications. I hung up the phone and sat at the table. I put a slice of bread on my plate, spread butter calmly, and ate, as I had done so many other days since I started again. But that day had a different flavor. I like justice. Not the vengeful justice of those who want to see others suffer, but the silent divine justice that only time can apply perfectly. I didn't take pleasure in denying help. I'm not that kind of person. But it wasn't about money. It was about awareness. About responsibility. About looking at one's own past and understanding the impact of the decisions we make. Because when you sow contempt, you can't reap affection. When you treat love as an obligation, you can't expect gratitude. And the strangest thing is that, even without meaning to cause pain, I knew that response had the power to provoke an inner earthquake. Because my absence, previously invisible, was now noticeable. And that was the real impact. Realizing that I was never the problem. That my silence only screamed because they refused to listen before. Now, it was too late to pretend they didn't know what they were doing. I got up from the table, opened the window, and let the breeze in. I looked at the plants, which grew calmly, unhurriedly, but steadily. Just like me. There, in that corner that was now mine, I understood that this journey wasn't just about food, control, or solitude. It was about transformation. About reclaiming parts of myself that had been buried under years of unacknowledged sacrifice. And even knowing that call could be my last, or the first of many, I felt at peace. Because when you choose yourself with love, everything around you begins to reorganize itself. Even silence changes its tone. And in that moment, my silence was the loudest sound of my victory. Today, my life is simple. I don't have a car in the garage or a full closet. What I have fits into a few boxes, but it takes up far more space inside me than anything I've ever bought. Because what I have now, what no one will ever take from me again, is dignity. And perhaps you'll only understand the weight of that word when you've lived long enough to know how often it's ignored behind the scenes of affection. For years, I heard that I should be grateful for shelter, food, and company. But no one asked if what I wanted most was respect. To be heard. To be seen. Many say that, with age, we become more fragile. And perhaps the body even confirms this. But the spirit, it matures with a strength that frightens even those who thought us fragile. Because when we're pushed to the depths of our soul, we either sink completely or find ground. And I found it. In the silence, in the solitude, in the pain that almost made me doubt myself. And I also found the courage to start over without an audience, without applause, without support. There are days when I wake up and still find myself staring at the ceiling, trying to remember where in my journey I became this woman who lives alone, makes her own coffee, talks to her plants, and writes notes to herself. But it's not sadness. It's recognition. Because of everything they took from me, control over my food, freedom of expression, even my space at the table, what I rebuilt alone is worth more. It's worth it entirely. And if you, who are listening to me now, feel like you've become a burden in the house where you should be a root, if you look around and no longer recognize yourself in the things, the words, the gestures, breathe. What you're feeling is legitimate. And you're not alone. You're not exaggerating. There's a hidden truth behind many of these good intentions they call care. And it hurts. But it can also liberate, if you have the courage to see it. Because there's a kind of freedom that doesn't come with open doors. But with doors we learn to close. Close firmly. Not with resentment. Close because you respect yourself. Because you know you deserve more. And the curious thing is, when you close these doors, others open. Within you. In your gaze. In your way of being. You stop asking permission to be who you are. And that changes everything. The greatest impact of my journey wasn't leaving my son's home. It was going back inside myself. Recovering memories, details of the woman who was always there, but who spent years hidden from view. Rebuilding my routine with small rituals that remind me, every day, that my life still matters. That my voice still resonates. That my silence carries history. That my presence doesn't need to be justified. I've learned that people only see as far as they can see. And sometimes, that's very little. But it doesn't matter. Because what defines who you are isn't how others look at you, but how you look at yourself. And if today I live with little, it's because I chose to live lightly. Light from grief, light from expectations, light from obligations that only brought me down. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I needed to leave. If at any point in your life you felt your value being negotiated, diminished, silenced, if you've ever heard that you're becoming a bit paranoid, or that it's best not to mess with that, or that all you do is complain, pay attention. These are phrases that carry layers. Phrases that slowly push you into the corner of your own existence. And we keep going, without realizing it. Until one day we wake up. And realize that the corner has become a prison. But no prison can resist the truth. And the truth is this. Those who have sacrificed their entire lives have the right to respect. They no longer need to prove anything. They don't need to beg for affection, nor negotiate dignity. Dignity is not negotiable. It is demanded. With calm, with presence, with action. And when life doesn't teach through love, it teaches through pain. But, in the end, it teaches. And when the lesson comes, it's impossible not to change. If you've made it this far, truly, thank you. Having you with me until the end of this story means a lot. Because every person who listens with an open heart makes this message go further. And who knows, maybe even touch someone who's going through something similar but hasn't yet found the strength to react. If this content brought you some clarity, if it lit a light inside you, if it reminded you of someone or even yourself, leave a comment below with the phrase, "That message was for me." This way I know who really walked with me until the very last minute. And I can continue bringing stories that matter, that welcome, that transform. Oh, and if you feel this conversation resonated, if this kind of content touches you, makes you feel good, subscribe to the channel. It's not just to receive new videos. It's to be part of a space that believes every life deserves to be told with respect. Likes also help a lot, you know? But not for the number. as a sign that this connection here was real. There's a video right here that complements everything we talked about. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over.